Hey guys, so Genshin just teased Escoffier in their 5.6 preview livestream, and like many of you, I've been highly anticipating a sort of freeze Chevreuse, freeze Nilu for like a year now, and that's basically what she is. In fact, this whole livestream segment was very much filled with Escoffier glaze. And honestly, normally they don't usually get too technical in these, but as you can see, they do emphasize how powerful her kit is for freeze teams in particular. The greater the number of Hydro and Cryo characters in the party, the greater the res reduction. They also emphasize her sub DPS damage that to me looks basically just like Emily's skill, except this one actually moves with you, so it looks a bit better. Damage wise, who knows, but they do emphasize she does good sub DPS damage. And lastly, they emphasized her team wide healing on her burst, which gives obvious synergy with Farina in these freeze teams. Now, I don't know how many of you caught it though, but honestly, this healing doesn't look that great in the live stream. The healing to your active character looked very nice, but the team-wide healing, like Xingqiu doesn't have that much HP. Probably has like 17,000 and it is barely even moving. Anyway, overall, she seems to be doing very similar stuff to Chevreuse. And yeah, with teams like this, or teams like this, we all know how much Chevreuse did to strengthen Electro DPSs. So my expectations are high. Anyway, as always, since I don't cover leaks, it's always challenging to think about what types of videos to make with these new characters. But I had a pretty fun idea, which was how can she impact the current cryo roster? There's 4 limited cryo DPSs. Eula's a physical DPS, she doesn't really count. So there's basically 3. And out of the 3, only Ayaka is really known for freeze teams, at least strength-wise. So Escoffier seems like an obvious fit with her. For example, if you look at Ayaka teams, it's so obvious if you look at this team here. Escoffier is a healer and a buffer and scales with a bunch of Hydro and Cryo teammates. So she obviously should fit in a team like this. Or if you also want to look at it, there was this old Ayaka team which uses Charlotte. And Charlotte does provide TTDS for Ayaka, but she doesn't really do anything else apart from healing. Whereas Escoffier brings healing, sub DPS, and a bit of shred. So I'm assuming she should be just an upgraded team like that. Anyway, but that's Ayaka. What about the Melt DPS's Ganyu and Wriothesley? So I thought it'd be fun theory crafting to basically work backwards. And by that I mean, I have some Wriothesley calcs I've done. I have some Ganyu calcs I did ages ago. And I'm really curious. Let's calculate how much damage these guys lose by not melting, and then sort of seeing how much buffs Escoffier teams need to bring to make it comparable. Obviously, I'll just be looking at personal damage, which means even after comparing the main DPS damage, there can still be sub DPS damage, which can make the teams overall stronger, but it's impossible for me to consider that at the moment. It's more viable for me to just look at the personal damage of Wriothesley and Ganyu. Okay, so I have these Wriothesley calcs here. You might remember this from my Wriothesley rerun video. And for example, he's starting at 900,000 damage. At C0 with his signature weapon, the exact numbers don't matter. But this is a Melt team where he's getting Melt multipliers, he's getting EM multipliers, he's getting Bennett buffs, he's getting a lot of buffs here. And the cool thing is seeing, let's just see how much this DPR drops by removing each buff. For example, if we remove Bennett's buff and Pyro Res, Jesus, we lost like 350,000 damage. If you remove Shilona's buff and probably her Res Shred as well, what was it? You're losing like 250k damage, something like that. And I think by the end of it, after I stripped most of the stuff down, I got like Wriothesley doing a third of his damage. You're removing all the buffs. But then, you know, we have to rebuild it. We have to see what kinds of stuff are we going to have in a freeze team. For example, first of all, because we're not doing any reactions on him, I can give an attack sands back. That raises the damage a bit. Also, whether it's Farina or Escoffier or whoever, a lot of his teammates probably do skill damage, which means I can get an extra 20% attack from tenacity. Then we look at the Farina buff. I'm assuming a lot of people are going to play Farina in these teams, but the thing is, like we alluded to earlier, I don't know how good Escoffier's healing is going to be, so I can't really assume the max Farina buff. But just for argument's sake, I can do 50% damage average buff, plus maybe some Yelan buffs, maybe Cryo Res, but there is a possibility you don't get Cryo Res if you're playing in the triple Hydro team. Anyway, after we do all those buffs before Escoffier, you can see his damage you can see I'm still doing only a bit more than a half of his damage in Melt. Less than 500k, you know, and changing the buffs doesn't actually matter that much. Like if I change Farina's average buff to 60%, which is not realistic at all, it only slightly increases the damage, so we don't need to get too worked up about that. Anyway, the biggest question is, how much res reduction are we actually getting here for Escoffier? The greater the number of Hydra and Cryo teammates, the greater the res reduction. Now, if we look at recent characters like Chevreuse, she gives 40% res shred. There's Shilonen giving 36%. And also, let's not forget, there is Silali. He only gives 20%. The thing is, it actually doesn't matter too much. Because, look, if I say it's like 20%, I gain like 5% damage. If she gets 30 resistance shred, I gain like 2% extra damage there. If it's 40, a bit more, still nowhere near Melt. And just for argument's sake, let's say there's a world where Escoffier gives 70% cryo resistance shred. Even if she is doing that, if you compare the damage, I'm still missing like a quarter of Wriothesley's damage. So the thing is, like, even if I get ridiculous, like I've got Farina buffs here, I've got some cryo res, some attack buffs, and even if I juice up that resistance shred to massive amounts, ridiculous amounts, I'm still never gonna get anywhere near Wriothesley's damage in a Melt team. Let's just say somewhere in these teams, Wriothesley gets a 50% attack buff. Let's add an extra 50% attack. And that's still nowhere near. So I don't see any universe where Wriothesley is doing more damage in these teams. But obviously, we haven't considered sub DPS damage yet. Anyway, let's move on to Ganyu. Now, Ganyu can play with the same supports. Very similar teams, Shilonen, Xiangling, Bennett, something like that. As you can get a lot of melts. And yeah, so with this calc, I'm starting off at like 1.17 million damage. And what we're going to do is slowly start removing stuff. Just by removing the melts, the damage is already half. The thing with Ganyu, she might be a bit more restrictive to Wriothesley. So if you're building a freeze team with her, Wriothesley you can play Yelan or even Xingqiu if you want. But Ganyu doesn't use normal attacks, you can't really do that. So you have to play Farina. But that means if you're playing Farina, you could probably use Marechaussee Hunter. So in the Melt team, I was using Wanderer's Troop. In the freeze team, you could probably use this. Okay, so if I switched it out and I didn't jank up my sheet, the damage is coming back. But again, we have to lose Bennett's buffs. Bennett gives a lot of attack. But let's start adding in Farina's buff. I'm not going to do an average. Again, we can't really get into anything more detailed than that. Obviously, if you're trying to do a more precise calc, you wouldn't just average Farina's buffs. You would do it like, you would track it over time. It might rise from 30% at like the start of your damage window to like, I don't know, 60% after that. But we're working with a rough calc. It's not too big of a deal. And yeah, let's give another tenacity buff. So what are we working with before we factor in Shenhe's quills? 66% of Ganyu's damage. Now the interesting thing about Ganyu is that in Melt teams, unless you're playing her with Mawika, you're probably using Ganyu's burst in Melt teams, but not all of this melts. Which means the biggest advantage Ganyu has over Wriothesley is that all of her skills and her charge attacks you're melting ideally, but in the Melt team your burst is kind of like a throwaway. But in a free team you're getting a way more damage from her burst, because you're benefiting from all the buffs rather than just a few of them melting. Now this is where things can get a bit more complicated. If you want to factor in Shenhe gives quite a lot of small buffs. Resistance shred here, cryo resistance shred, cryo damage bonus, some more cryo damage bonus, and her quills. So going back to the Wriothesley calc, I plugged in Shenhe's quills and her damage buffs and the res shred, and it boosted damage quite a bit. I mean, obviously this is still very generous. Now it's hard to say like how things are going to work out if you're going to use Shenhe's hold or her press, because each of them have different cooldowns. The hold is a slightly longer cooldown, but it gives more quills, but you might get more quills overall with the press. At the moment in Wriothesley and Ganyu teams, a lot of people use her hold because it gives an extra 15% damage buff. But for Ganyu it still works out, because if you use the press, you're going to get more quills, which scale better in a triple cryo team, by the way, because there's more cryo characters to activate all these icy quills. But Ganyu can benefit from the skill and burst damage here. So there we go. After all that, and yeah, still pretty optimistic assumptions here. I'm getting about 88% damage, but it's not bad. Wriothesley, it was quite a bit weaker with Shenhe, and then if you're playing someone like Yelan instead, it's a lot weaker. It basically means even looking at a very optimistic scenario in a freeze team, I cannot get Ganyu and Wriothesley, especially Wriothesley, I cannot get them doing the same amount of damage that they do in a melt team. Again, personal damage. I don't think they will be able to get near the amount of damage they do in a melt team. And that's because, you know, even if there's super strong buffers like Farina, Escoffier, Shenhe, or Yelan, or Lali, whoever you're playing, none of that buff-wise can really compare to getting the melt multipliers, getting Bennett's massive attack buffs, even Xilonen herself, very powerful buffer in melt teams. And yeah, it just can't really compare. But what does that mean? Does that mean it's likely the freeze teams are not going to be as strong as the melt teams? No, because like I said, we did not consider the rest of the team. Even if Wriothesley's damage is a lot worse in a freeze team, or in a melt team, this is where your damage is coming from. Bennett, Xilonen do no damage, so your only damage is coming from Xiangling. You can also play Marika in that role, but her damage is not going to be insane. Whereas, how they were sales pitching Escoffier, she does good sub DPS damage, so you have her damage. You'd have Farina's damage in a freeze team, who should also be getting some nice buffs. And then if you're playing Yelan with Wriothesley, she'd be doing pretty good damage as well. So even if Wriothesley's damage isn't near his melt team's damage, once you add all the sub DPS up, it could still equal a very strong team. Even Shenhe will be contributing a lot of damage, because you could have 3 cryo characters all triggering her quills, which will scale very nicely. So if Wriothesley is losing 300k damage, it's quite likely, even if he is being wheelchaired in like more of a driver role, you'd easily make up that 300k between your sub DPSs. With Ganyu, she does more personal damage, but she might not be getting as much sub DPS damage. Plus, you add in the fact that Escoffier is a new character, you know, with all the Natlan power creep, she probably does scale very well with investment. So it might not even be the case where traditionally investing in your hyper carries and making them do as much damage as possible, that might not be able to outweigh all the benefits that you're getting from Escoffier. So overall, like, there's so many possibilities, there's so many different ways this could turn out. So yeah, I thought that was quite a fun exercise. What did we learn? We learned that melt is a very strong reaction, but we also learned that melt doesn't have as much sub DPS and doesn't have the best supports compared to freeze, where, let's be honest, like, they are selling Escoffier so hard in these freeze teams. The synergy should be out of this world. So I'm expecting the teams to be very strong. Just don't expect your character to do as much personal damage as they might have been doing before. Like, for example, in a Wriothesley team like this, they're showing Escoffier, Xingqiu, Lali. Lali's not buffing your Wriothesley, Xingqiu's not really buffing your Wriothesley. So Wriothesley's damage in that team is probably quite bad. And yeah, last word on Ayaka, because she is already played in freeze teams. They're showing off this premium freeze team here: Escoffier, Farina, Ayaka, Shenhe. I expect that team to just be a straight upgrade for Ayaka, except for the fact that Ayaka, her burst can whiff. And a lot of people are very skeptical about how Ayaka will work without Kazuha. And for me, it's hard to say how that will really end up. Like, I've always said, even though Ayaka is normally very reliant on Kazuha's grouping in order for her burst to actually hit everything, teams are only as strong as miHoYo lets them be. Although Ayaka is more reliant on grouping than Wriothesley or Ganyu, I could easily see them releasing a bunch of freeze content where that isn't an issue. I mean, we can literally go into the current floor 12 here. As you can see, we now know that the second half is very much tailored for Escoffier. And if you look at all of this, you actually can't really group any of these enemies. So what they could quite easily do is, for the next few patches, they just release ungroupable content, a lot of bossing, and if they are going to do AoE content, it's content where the enemies are already grouped. Like even this top half here, the enemies kind of group themselves, and then you won't notice Ayaka's issues with playing without Kazuha, but they'll sort of like hide the team's issues, and then I think it could work like that. But hopefully you found these calculations interesting. I find it quite interesting, and yeah, look forward to more videos on Escoffier. I'm very excited for her. As you can see, I do play a lot of cryo characters. I've made loads of videos on cryo characters. So I'll probably be posting updates once they reveal more information, once the Chinese creators get to test them in their early access videos. And yeah, you guys can look forward to that. Thanks for watching.